Hello and welcome. I'm Dianne Olegard with the Public Affairs Forum of the First Unitarian Universalist Church of Austin. Our program's mission is to nourish the mind and spirit and to serve social justice. Our forums occur on most Sundays at noon and are free and open to the public. We encourage you to attend. Our church is located at 4700 Grover Avenue. For more information about our public affairs forums, you can go to our church website at www.austinuu.org. And today we have Dianne Olegard from Austin Bat Refuge. Dianne Olegard studied graphic design in college, but has always been fascinated by bats and other urban wildlife, and by the various ways humans respond to them. For over a decade, she served as a Bat Conservation International's urban bat specialist, advising the public about bats in buildings, bats in public health, and artificial roosts. She co-authored publications on bat control in schools and on aspects of bats in human structures, and continues to present programs promoting bat conservation with her own nonprofit, Austin Bat Refuge. She and her husband share their home with Zoe and Zuzu, African straw-colored fruit bats, and the state-permitted wildlife rehabilitators, with as many as 70 native Texas bats of 9 different species. And we're proud to have Dianne join us today.
Thank you very much, Dan. So I am Dianne Olegard, and we do run Austin Bat Refuge, which is an education and conflict resolution and rehabilitation organization right here in Austin. We do happen to be the only people in Austin who do bat rehabilitation, so you can imagine we get quite a few bats into our facility all year round. Okay, so we're going to advance the slide and talk a little bit about the history of bats in the world. Bats have been on this planet for over 50 million years. This particular fossil replica that you see on the screen is about 52 million years old, and if you saw the skeleton of an insect-eating bat today, it would look identical to this skeleton. They've been of this particular shape and form for a very, very long time, obviously long before humans made it to planet Earth. So bats belong to a mammalian order that is called Chiroptera, and Chiroptera is a Greek word that generally means hand, wing, or winged hand. And you can see that the human skeleton is not so terribly different. You see, bats have hands. I think that little boy is very interested, and I want to talk about how our bones are very, very similar. We have a thumb and 4 fingers, and bats also have a thumb and 4 fingers. And those fingers that the bats have are very elongated. So my fingers would reach all the way to the floor if I was a bat, and if I was a bat, my knees and my feet would be backwards. So there are reasons for that as well, and it's a really interesting thing about bats because they can hang from a roost and drop instantly into flight because of the way their knees and their feet are positioned. There are a lot of bats in the world. They live everywhere except for the very coldest Arctic regions, and they make up about 20% of the mammals in the entire world. Only rodents have a larger population. So the diversity includes very tiny bats like this bat, which is the bumblebee bat. It's a very endangered bat, as many bats in the world are, and it lives only in Thailand. From that, we can go to the very largest bats, which can have a wingspan of about 6 feet. These are fruit-eating bats, and they're not scary bats at all. They're actually bats that have a beautiful sort of dog-like face. And people are easily relating to these kinds of bats because they look so much like animals that we actually love. They look like our pet dogs. So most bats have only 1 baby a year. And because they're mammals, mothers give birth to live pups, and they have fur or hair, so they're all very, very soft, and some bats actually have more than 1 pup. This is the minority of bats. Most bats have 1 a year. Some bats, like the foliage roosting bats, and we have some of these with us today to show you, can have as many as 4. And that's when they get in trouble in the summertime. They have a lot of pups that attract a lot of attention up in the trees where they roost. Next. Now, bats do a lot of things for people. In my particular opinion, they don't need to do anything for us. They deserve to be here because they've been on the planet for such a long, long time and have developed into such interesting animals over millennia. However, they do eat an awful lot of bugs, and pest insect suppression is one of their main contributions to human health and comfort. The fruit bats are seed dispersers. They actually disperse seeds far from the tree where they got the fruit, and they can actually regrow forests that have been burned or clear cut, which is an important function in the rainforest, the subtropical areas where they live. Some bats are pollinators. Some of the fruit bats are pollinators. They collect pollen on their fur when they grab fruit that is near flowers. And the nectar-drinking bats, and there are 3 of those in the United States, also are pollinators. So that's an important function. Of course, ecotourism. We know all about ecotourism here in Austin with the Congress Avenue Bridge, and in Round Rock with McNeil Bridge, and the large roosts in caves around central Texas. They also contribute to medicine. The lowly vampire bat that scares so many people, just the idea of a vampire bat scares people. But the fact is that the saliva of the vampire bat has been synthesized into a human medicine for heart and stroke victims. And also, the Navy is using a model of bat echolocation for sonar research. So also cultural relevance. Bats have cultural relevance in several countries around the world. This is an image of what we call a wu-fu, and this is a Chinese symbol that indicates that bats are good luck. The red objects around the circle are all bats, and in the center is a Chinese character. It looks exactly like the Chinese character for good luck, and the one for bats is identical. So that's why bats are considered good luck. The wu is 5, and the fu is bats and good fortune. This is an Australian cave. Images from about 15 to 30,000 years ago. It's clear to me that the native people of Australia at that time loved and revered these bats because the images are so beautiful. I just love those images. I think they clearly took a lot of time to paint them in a very beautiful way. These, of course, are fruit bats. Lots of large flying fox fruit bats in Australia. Bats are also the only mammal that has true flight. There are gliding mammals, as we know. Sometimes you hear about flying squirrels or flying lemurs, but bats are really the only mammal that has true flight skills. So this is a picture up close of what a bat's wing looks like, and you can see how intricate the wing is. It's 2 layers of very thin material that feels a little bit like a latex or a nitrile glove. And within those 2 layers, we have blood vessels and nerve and muscle fibers. Those wings perform an incredibly important function for bats. As bats fly, that's an incredibly energetic activity, and they have to have a way of dispersing some heat away from their bodies, and that is one of the functions that wings have for bats. Otherwise, they just would collapse from overheating as they flew. Bats' heart rate can be 1,000 beats per minute as they fly. And of course, bats echolocate. So though many of us in the world, and children and adults both, believe that bats are blind, they aren't. They're not blind at all. They can see quite well. However, nighttime vision would be problematic for bats, just as it is for humans. And so echolocation is their second way of perceiving the world in front of them. They send out a sonar wave through their mouth and sometimes through their nose, And that wave will hit an insect that they want to eat. It might run into a wall of a building that they would like to avoid. They navigate at night in pitch blackness perfectly with the aid of echolocation. So we always say that they can see with their eyes and they can also see with their ears. This is an image of the sonar research that the Navy is doing. Apparently, this model, based on bat echolocation, gives a much clearer image than any previous technology that they used before. Habitats, bats live in a lot of different types of habitats all over the world. Remember, they live everywhere except for the Arctic frozen regions. There are no insects for bats to eat there, and certainly no fruit. They live in caves. A lot of people think, oh, they all live in caves. But they don't. This is an image, though, of Bracken Cave from the inside with bats flying out. In the summer, there are about 15 to 20 million bats living in Bracken Cave near San Antonio. They live in bridges. We all know that. About 1.5 million here, Congress Avenue Bridge in Austin. And they live sometimes in buildings, and they do that not because they want to live near people, far from it. They like to roost in places like attics or perhaps under roofing materials, under siding on a house, any place where it's warm and they might be able to actually raise a family of bats in a comfortable and safe place, avoiding predators. Now, they do that mainly because of habitat loss. It's not that they like buildings better than their normal habitats. It's that their normal habitats, many of which are in forests, are disappearing at such an alarming rate. They live in all kinds of areas of forests. They live under the bark of trees. They live inside hollow trees. We have a bat with us today. It's an evening bat that roosts inside hollow trees and hollow branches of trees. They roost in trees in Africa where these straw-colored flying fox bats are native. They roost in the thousands in these trees right in the middle of big, noisy cities in Africa. They roost here in Austin even, some of them, in palm trees. That picture below shows how beautiful the color of the bat matches those dry skirts of dead fronds underneath. And we have one of these bats with us too. They get in trouble in the summertime when people trim those dead fronds. So we want people to know, and we want you to tell friends who may have palm trees on their property, they should never be trimmed in the summertime. There's a lot of injury, a lot of mortality that happens to this species of bat and other species occasionally, and in fact even other species of mammals who are roosting up in the safety of those fronds in the summer. So they also roost in our flight cage. We have a very large flight cage in back of our home. And in this particular picture, we have a little eastern red bat, and we have one of those with us today, too. And we'll show those as soon as we're finished with the program. We'll show you bats up close, and you'll be able to see some of the amazing features that these bats have on their bodies and some of their facial features, which most people never really get to see. Bats look like all kinds of other animals at times, and I truly believe that this flying fox looks most like my friend's Chihuahua Pablo. You can see that there could be a separated at birth situation here. And from these images, you see an awful lot of differences, a lot of colors. People think bats are black and gray only, but not at all. Bats are red. Bats can be yellow and lavender, like the African yellow-winged bat on top. The one in the middle is one of my favorites, though I've never actually seen one live. I've seen only photos of the spotted bat. Literally pink, giant ears, and white and black spots on its body. And that's a West Texas bat. Roosts in Big Bend area, in rocky crevices, and is just the most interesting looking bat in the world. The one on the top right is one of the free-tail bats from Africa that has a little mohawk that he can display during mating season. Quite attractive, I think. So bats eat a lot of different things too. There's quite a bit of diversity there. However, the majority of bats in the world, 70% or so, eat insects. So they're doing this all over the world. They are eating crop pest insects, not only in Texas and the United States, but all over the world. And they're saving a lot of money. They're doing it for free. $3.7 billion a year in the United States is the lower estimate of how much money they save to agriculture. This is because of pesticides that don't have to be bought and used, keeping clearly our water and our soil and our produce much more safe. Fruit-eating bats. 2 bats in this photograph are actually bats that live with us. That's Zoe and Zuzu. They are African straw-colored flying fox bats, and they have been sort of education and ambassador bats for their entire lives. They're 28 and 25 years old, and they are shown in this photograph eating their favorite food, which is watermelon. I don't know that they actually find that in Africa where they're native to, but they love it here. Now, the nectar drinking and eating bats that I talked about being pollinators are really, really important for the wild versions of so many plants. And so many of those plants are making human life better. All the products that come from so many plants that are pollinated by bats help humans all over the world. This is really great. I love this story. There was just recently a paper that was put out a couple of years ago about the pallid bat, and this is one of the most interesting bats in the United States. It actually does eat scorpions and centipedes, and it's immune to the venom of those insects. This is clearly a shot that was set up during a mist netting session, catching some bats in Arizona. But they do eat those insects. But the discovery recently was that they actually also drink nectar. So they're actually insect eaters and pollinators. And there may be more bats that eat insects that actually have other functions that are helpful to us. Here's a little series of photos showing a pallid bat, which is a gleaning bat. The pallid bat goes down to the ground and picks up insects. Most bats actually fly after flying insects. But this one and the next one show this pallid bat grabbing a big giant centipede and flying off. About the same size as the bat is, and remember, immune to the sting. Not to say they don't get bitten. They do. They get stung, but they just don't care. So we know a lot of things that bats eat, and a lot of creatures eat bats. This is actually a photo of an owl sitting on top of our flight cage at home, watching the bats flying below. Very interested, you can tell. Hawks eat a lot of bats. Raccoons, skunks, and snakes. And virtually anything that can catch a bat will eat a bat. In some parts of the world, people eat bats, the large fruit bats. So the bats that live in central Texas are numerous. There are probably a good dozen, 12 to 15, that are right around our area all the time. But there are over 1,400 species of bats in the world. And that's growing all the time because there's so many areas that bats live that are unexplored. So there are probably a lot more species of bats in the world than 1,400. In Texas, we have 34, and there are 47 in the United States. And again, about a dozen year-round in central Texas. Does anybody know how many of those more than 1,400 species in the world are blood drinkers, what we call vampire bats? Anyone have an idea? He said 7. Not that many. Good idea. That's a good guess. There are only 3. Only 3 species of bats drink blood. None of them live in Texas, in spite of the crazy news stories you occasionally read. They don't live here, but they do live in Latin America. They live in Mexico and Central and South America. And they are not exactly what people think they are. This is a photo of a little vampire bat drinking blood, or actually lapping blood from the foot of a chicken. And in fact, 2 of the 3 species of vampire bats in the world drink blood only from birds. And the 3rd drinks blood from mammals, and these days it's mostly livestock. One of my favorite bats, and of course we have one with us today, is the Mexican free-tailed bat. And this is the bat that lives in the very large bridge and cave roosts in Texas and other states in about the southern half of the United States. This bat actually can fly almost 100 miles an hour. And that's amazing. That's in level flight. That's faster than any bat and any bird in level flight. So they fly fast, they fly high, they can fly 2 miles up in the sky, and they eat a lot of bugs. Cave myotis is another common central Texas bat. They roost in caves and sometimes in bat houses with free tails. This is a northern yellow bat. This is the one that roosts in the palm fronds. And they're beautiful bats. We get a lot of them in every summer, adults and pups, when people trim those palm fronds. So please keep that in mind for anyone you know who has palm trees on their property. Eastern red bats, we talked about them a few minutes ago. This is one of the species. It's a foliage bat that can have more than one baby during the year. They can, only one time a year, but they can have as many as 4, and in a few cases, 5. And what's interesting about bats is bats are very small. They're smaller than most people realize. And their pups are actually very large in comparison with the mother. They're small to us, tiny to us, but in fact the bat pups generally are born about 1/4 to 1/3 the size of the mother. So if you use that example and think about a human mother, that would be approximately a 40-pound infant. So I don't think we would be reproducing much if that were the case with humans. This is a beautiful Seminole bat, very similar in some ways to the red bat. They roost in trees as well, but they roost in pine trees. And you wouldn't think that there would be a very good camouflage system for a bat like this. They're kind of mahogany brown, really beautiful. But they actually curl their furry tail membrane around themselves and look like a pine cone. So they can hide very well. Evening bat, this is the one that roosts in hollow trees and hollow branches of trees. And this is the bat that was the model for the illustrator of Toothless the Dragon and How to Train Your Dragon. Very much a plain but lovely little bat, very small. And the tricolored bat, one of the smallest bats in the United States, eating a very large mealworm here. So threats to bats are many, and they're growing, unfortunately, as time goes on and as technology in the human world improves. Loss of habitat is still one of the biggest issues for bats. Increasing urbanization, including light pollution in cities. Disturbance of caves is a big problem for bats. White nose syndrome, and click on that. White nose syndrome has killed over 7 million bats, probably many more than 7 million since it was discovered in a cave in upstate New York in 2007. It's a fungus that affects only bats, no other animals, and not humans. And it's caused lots and lots of mortality. Wind turbines are killing millions of bats. And of course, human ignorance and fear, almost more than any other type of animal, is harming and killing bats. So white nose syndrome, WNS, and it's called that because the bats that are affected by this usually have a white fungus on their nose and mouth area. There are a lot of things that scientists are studying that are listed here that are doing their best to try to slow the progress of white nose syndrome. We don't think that it's actually going to be cured. We hope that the bats will eventually become immune to the fungus, which has happened in Europe. It's an invasive species, actually, that came from European caves. So there are lots of things that are happening that scientists are studying with some funding from the federal government, but not nearly enough. And this is what we do at home when we get a bat in. We want to look at their wings, which is another spot where the fungus can actually take hold. And if we look at that under a black light, the fungus is supposed to fluoresce. And we understand that it doesn't do it every time, but we're hoping that since we've never seen that fluorescing fungus of a bat coming into our refuge, that we don't have any bats with white nose syndrome at the refuge. Wind turbines are an issue that is kind of an uncomfortable one for bat conservationists, because wind turbines, of course, are touted as clean, green energy. And that, of course, that is true, certainly to an extent. However, every technology has some unintended consequences, and with this technology, bat and bird mortality is a really serious unintended consequence. So there are a lot of things that when we're working, when scientists work with wind energy companies, and it's voluntary. Some companies are willing to work with conservationists and some aren't. But the ones that are studying different ways to at least decrease the mortality of bats being killed at wind turbines. The urban landscape is another issue. And we find, after talking to a lot of people who are involved in urban planning, wild animals in the urban landscape are rarely considered in planning processes, or if at all, they're more of an afterthought. So this is a brochure that was written by me and another colleague at BCI before I left BCI last year. And it's kind of a overview of bats in buildings, not only in urban areas, but buildings all over the place. And it talks about why and how bats get into buildings. And one of the things that it talks about is the fact that buildings are frequently built with openings for small wildlife. And of course, the openings are meant for ventilation. But with ventilation, if it's not closed with some sort of mesh that air can get through but animals can't, then you have the problem of bats and other animals in buildings. It's a problem for people in more of a perceived way, but it's often a mortal problem for wildlife. They get in because sometimes it's youngsters. At this time of year, we've got young bats of the year, about 5 months old. They're toddlers, really, in their behavior, although for all practical purposes, they're adults. They're flying, they're chasing insects, and they're surviving, but they get lost, and they are experiencing for the very first time things like migration activity. So they might end up in a rainstorm, and they've never experienced that before, and they didn't know yet that bats can't fly in rain. They might end up on your porch, or they end up on the side of a building where they're in clear sight of people, and people get very concerned about that. Sometimes concerned for the bat, sometimes concerned for the people who are living or working in the building. So prevention is the key, and there are lots of ways to do this, preferably at a time when you're not terrified and distracted and frightened by a bat that accidentally gets into your living room or your office. So this is an example of a place where lots of bats get in. This is the Irwin Center here in Austin. And that building, of course, has a lot of big bay doors. There are concerts, there are plays, all kinds of things that include a lot of equipment that are brought in by large trucks. So those big bay doors are often left open at night. And because the building is all lit up, there are a lot of insects that fly around that building. And because there are insects, there are bats chasing the insects. So bats get caught in these buildings. And getting in is one thing, getting out is something else entirely, and they don't do that very well. So this is an example of some news stories we've heard about a couple of times in the past several years, where a bat might swoop down to the floor during a basketball game. People on the court playing basketball, thousands of people in the stands, and suddenly a bat is there, and you wonder why on earth would that bat fly down to the floor in all that light and commotion and noise. The reason, it turns out, after some studies were done a few years ago, the bat actually perceives a flat, shiny surface like a gym floor as water. So the reason the bat is doing that is the bat is dehydrated, it's beginning to starve, and it's thirsty. So even though the people around who see this are feeling that the bat may be attacking them, that's actually the last thing that the bat is thinking about. That bat wants to drink water. And of course, mythology is always a problem for bats. This time of year, Halloween, we all like to think about bats as scary. We think about vampires turning into bats. But the truth is that vampires and bats were not connected until fairly recently. Bram Stoker came about in the 1800s, late 1800s, but there are actually myths all over the world about bats turning into other animals. And of course, bats and human hair. This is one that we really hear about a lot. There are all kinds of myths for many, many hundreds of years all over the world. And as you can see, the consequences range from annoyance to death. This is usually about women's hair. This is, in my opinion, one of the biggest threats, misinformation. So be careful about what you read. And if you're writing about bats, be very careful about what you write. The truth is, and this is an important takeaway, if you learn nothing else about bats, I want people to learn this, that the vast majority of bats do not have or contract rabies, nor do bats have a carrier status. And this is something that you hear constantly. Bats are rabies carriers. They're not carriers. The fact is that when bats get rabies, they die from it, like any mammal. And bats don't get rabies more often than other mammals. It's just that bats are very small. If they end up on the ground, one reason might be because they're sick. They're tiny, they're easily captured. It would be easy for someone to be bitten by a bat. So it's really important for people to understand that just don't put your finger in a bat's mouth. Don't try to handle a bat. There are other ways to safely capture a bat if that's what you want to do and need to do. Merlin Tuttle, who started Bat Conservation International in the mid-'80s, said this in the foreword to a recent book. Like most animals, bats are threatened by habitat loss and degradation. However, they are also uniquely threatened, almost universally, by humans. Now, protection for bats actually is quite small. It goes state by state. Some states have a little bit of protection. Actually, Texas has a little bit of protection. The law in Texas says that bats are protected if they're in a natural roost and they are on or in a building that is not inhabited by people. So that means, of course, that in a building that is, they really are not protected. However, there's a little bit of protection from the Environmental Protection Agency. It's indirect, but you can't use chemicals to kill bats. It's not labeled. Nothing is labeled to kill bats. Help bats by staying out of caves. Tell friends and neighbors the truth about bats, and educate yourself. And this is a poster that should be in a lot of places around this town to tell people that they're gentle animals, they don't attack. However, they may bite in self-defense, like any animal might. And if you grab a bat with your hand outstretched, the bat might think that you look a little bit like this. So you can imagine that they would feel threatened. You can install a bat house. A lot of people are interested in that, and I'm happy to talk to anyone by email or on the phone about that and how to do it well. And you can help us, help Austin Bat Refuge help bats. Giving Tuesday is coming up on November 27th. The Austin, it's all over the country, but think about helping us out on Giving Tuesday or during Amplify Austin in March. We're happy to take donations from people who want to help us, and we're happy to have people think about matching donations to Austin Bat Refuge at either of those times. Go to our website, please, and check out information. Go to our Instagram site and see a lot of videos and photographs. And think about bats as beneficial rather than frightening. Let's go. We're going to show you some bats. We can take questions if anyone has any while we're showing bats close up.
Thank you. I'm Eric Hartman. Thank you for a very interesting presentation.
Thank you.
I'm interested in a story I once heard about the introduction of bats in some kind of structures around San Antonio for mosquito suppression, I understood.
Exactly.
Can you describe that experiment?
Yeah, really interesting. It was a man by the name of Charles Campbell. Charles Campbell was a physician back in the 1920s, and he believed that putting up large structures for bats to live in would help to alleviate the cases of malaria in the area. And he did put up a very large, it's a really beautiful structure. I don't have a photograph of it here. What you do see here, though, is a Mexican free-tailed bat, and these are the bats that he wanted to move into that structure. These are the ones that live in large numbers, eat huge quantities of insects, and that moved into that structure. He actually did have bats moving in. Now, I'm not sure that the malaria rates were changed greatly. I think there was a bit of a downtick. All bats, we believe, eat mosquitoes opportunistically. However, there are not very many American bat species where mosquitoes are one of the main foods in their diets, but they do eat them. The thing about bats and mosquitoes is that it's important to realize that a bat house occupied with bats is not going to solve your mosquito problem. It's one step that will have an effect, but there are a lot of other things that you should do too. There's actually a book about that story that you're talking about, and I can't remember, I have it at home and I can't quite remember the title, but if you Googled Dr. Campbell's Bat Roost, you would get the name of that book, and it's fascinating. It's a fascinating book. There were 2 other bat towers, I think they called them, built around the United States. There was one in Florida, which I believe no longer exists, but there is one in Comfort, Texas, that does still exist. And you can see that. It's on private property, but I think you can see it from some road areas. So check that out. You'll get a lot of information about that online. So that was a little Mexican free-tail eating a mealworm, which is what we feed bats. And this is that June bug. All right, this is one of the eastern red bats that I talked a little bit about. She's one of the foliage bats, and like most of the foliage bats, she can have as many as 4 pups once a year. So I talked about them running into trouble when they have babies up in those trees. Usually this little bat just hangs solitary. They're solitary bats. They don't live with thousands or millions of their buddies like the free-tails do. But they're alone, and they curl their tail membrane around and look like a little dried leaf. However, when they have pups, and remember the pups are large, she has 4 pups that very quickly become close to her size, and they make a lot of commotion. And they attract the attention of grackles and blue jays. Both birds actually will attack and kill and eat bats. And we get a lot of injured and orphaned bats in during the summer because of this. Beautiful bats, black wing membranes, long, really beautiful fur, kind of reddish fur, and a really, very different look from the Mexican free-tailed bats. All bats have a very different look from each other, and you can see how small this bat is. This is an adult. All the bats that we have with us are adults, and they're much smaller than people realize when their wings are folded against the body. They're quite small and they're quite fragile, and I think that's one of the benefits that we find of showing bats up close to people, is that not only do they see that they're not quite what they might have thought bats were, but they see that bats are fragile, and that's a really important message for people in terms of getting people to believe that it's important to protect bats and bat roosts. So she's an adult. She's quite tiny, and she is, we actually have her as an education bat because she came in with 2 siblings, not this past summer, but the one before. And her siblings were released. They flew away beautifully. This particular sibling just didn't fly well enough to be released. We couldn't put her out in the wild knowing that she was really going to just attract a predator and not make it. So she lives with us in our flight cage, like many of our non-releasable bats, and has as good a life as we can give her, and she'll be with us for her lifetime. We have about 40 bats right now that are in our permanent colonies. Many of them live out in our flight cage and can fly a little bit. If they can fly, we let them out there to fly. They can catch insects in the flight cage. We have a black light that stays on all night and attracts insects to the flight cage, and we have an organic garden in the flight cage that also attracts insects. So there's all kinds of wild insects for bats to eat, and we also feed them mealworms out of little coop cups, like bird cups. So they have backup feeding, and they have, I think, a pretty satisfying life for the most part. This one is northern yellow bat. This is the one that roosts in palm trees. And this is a little larger. This is one of the larger bats, and they don't get a lot bigger than this in the United States. But she's certainly full grown, and she is fairly large and a bat that would blend in beautifully with the palm fronds hanging underneath the living tree. Now, she had a head injury earlier this year when she was a pup. She experienced this trauma when they were trimming these palm fronds from her tree down in Corpus Christi. She fell to the ground. Her mother flew off in panic. She fell to the ground, broke her leg, and hit her head. So she has a head injury that has not resolved, and she's going to be living with us for her lifetime as well. She's a great education bat because she's very, very calm and very happy to be held and stroked while she, if not eating a mealworm, holds it in her mouth. These are sleepy bats. It's a little hard for them to wake up, which is part of the reason why they get in such trouble when the palm fronds are trimmed. They may not wake up on their way to the ground, especially if they trim them in the winter when it's chilly. They're in palm fronds all year round. Best time to trim them, if you have to do it, is fall and spring, but not summer or winter. Her name is Buffy, not because of the vampire slayer, but because we believe that she looks a lot like a buffalo. Can you show her face? She has that kind of broad face and kind of a hairdo there on top, kind of a pompadour. And it's just a really, really beautiful bat.
If you do find a bat on your property or you're in the public and you do find a bat, what's the best way to handle it safely?
It depends on the circumstances, but there are several options. If you find a bat that you believe is injured or is displaced and in a place that might not be safe for the bat or for people walking by, you can do one of several things. If you want to take the bat to a rehabilitator like us, we welcome you bringing those bats, and on our website we show you 2 or 3 different ways to safely capture a bat without having to touch it. Pair of leather gloves, a box or a coffee can over the bat on the ground, on the wall, on the ceiling, and a light piece of cardboard like a file folder slid gently underneath. You have the bat contained. Now, this is important to know. This is only if you're positive, or as positive as you can be, that there's been no contact by a human or a pet. And by contact, I mean the possibility of a person or a pet being bitten by the bat. If someone has been bitten, or there's a good chance that someone or a pet has been bitten, the thing to do is to call animal control. Austin Animal Control unfortunately euthanizes every bat they pick up, and it's important to know that because people are not aware of that. However, there are certainly cases where that is the right thing to do. And it's not because a lot of bats have rabies. You have to understand that that's because someone has been bitten, and the only way that you can prove that a bat doesn't have rabies is to test it for rabies, and you simply can't test a living animal for rabies. Otherwise, the person who's been bitten has to have post-exposure rabies vaccinations. Now, they're not in the stomach anymore. It's not widely known. I get the feeling from what I hear from the public. Most people seem to think that it's still, 25 shots in the stomach. But it isn't that way anymore. It's been a different vaccine since about 1980. The shots are in the deltoid muscle of the upper arm, so it's the exact same type of vaccination as a flu shot or any of the other vaccinations that we typically get. You get 4 of them, and you get some human immune globulin if you've had a bite. And that's something that gives you immediate protection. Now, all of this is extremely expensive, and that's one of the worst problems. If you have insurance coverage, I like to think that no insurance company is cynical enough to not cover a life-saving treatment. One never knows these days, but generally I think you can expect insurance to cover it. If you're not insured, then you're going to be spending or owing a lot of money. And so that's the issue. You know, euthanizing an animal is something that we dislike doing, but we do it in those cases. So this is, this is a cave myotis. This is an amazing and beautiful bat. There are a lot of these. They're probably the second most numerous of the bat species in this area. They're called they're Myotis velifer or cave myotis or simply cave bats. And these bats also roost in caves, and they roost in some of the same caves that Mexican free-tailed bats roost in, but in a different part of the cave. This is one of the bats that has been found to have white nose syndrome occasionally. Many states now have found this fungus in caves where hibernating bats live. Only bats that hibernate in caves have been affected by white nose syndrome, and this is one of the species that has. They roost in a different part of a cave than free-tails would because they prefer a different temperature while they're hibernating. Free-tailed bats are not hibernating bats. Even though they live in some caves, they don't hibernate. So we don't believe that Mexican free-tailed bats will get the disease of white nose syndrome and be killed. However, we do think that because free-tailed bats migrate long distances, that they may actually carry the fungus on their fur and spread it to other colonies that do hibernate in caves. One more? Okay, one more bat, and this is the little bat that roosts in hollow trees and hollow branches, and it's called an evening bat. This is the one that was represented by Toothless the Dragon in How to Train Your Dragon. And this is a little bat that is named Midnight. That red on the ears does not come with the bat. That is not a decoration that the bat is born with, but it's one that we use to differentiate a bat where we have several different members of that species out in our flight cage, and we want to be sure we know who's who, because some of them are releasable and some of them aren't. So this is a very small bat as well. This is a tiny bat that is, like the others, an adult. And they call these bats evening bats because they are the first bats, one of the first bats to come out foraging in the evening. They forage over waterways, they like to forage over lakes and rivers, and to eat the insects that they find there. Another problem for these bats, of course, is since they do roost in those hollow trees and branches, people who cut down dead trees on their property can affect a lot of these bats, and that's usually how we get these in. Somebody cuts down a dead tree and suddenly they see a few bats flying away, and then they find one that's still in maybe a hollow log that they've put through their log splitter. We actually got a bat in a log that had been run through a log splitter. They brought the whole log to us in a box with the bat inside. The bat was not injured, miraculously, but was back in a crevice inside that log. So another thing to keep in mind, try to keep, if you have property, try to keep some dead vegetation, some dead trees. You know, cut down the part that's going to fall on your house in a big storm, but keep some for habitat. Bats and a lot of other animals roost in those dead snags. So that is the last bat that we have. There are lots more at our refuge. And just in case anyone's interested, if you decide to become a member of Austin Bat Refuge, one benefit you get from that is a visit to the refuge and a tour of our bat facilities and all of our bats. Thank you very much.
I had one more question. I know that Austin has a pretty big tourist attraction with the Austin Bat Bridge. I was wondering, how do you feel about that, and how do you feel that if it's a positive thing for?
I think absolutely. I think the Congress Avenue Bridge Colony has been an incredibly positive thing for Austin. It brings in the neighborhood of $10 million a year. People coming in to see those bats and to shop in the stores and to stay in the hotels. And it's a very safe it's a safe thing to watch those bats at fairly close proximity. 30-some years of bats being under that bridge and people watching them. No one, to our knowledge, in this city has ever gotten a disease from those bats. And that's a safety record that we want to continue into the future. And it's all about not grabbing a bat with bare hands, or at all, if possible. Any other questions?
Thanks again. I'm also interested in the mention you made of migration. Is that something that is typical of all bats, that they migrate?
No, not all bats. Bats that live in a temperate climate like ours, when it gets chilly in the winter, do one of two things. They hibernate or they migrate. Most bats in this area hibernate, but the Mexican free-tailed bats are migrators. And they migrate long distance, over 1,000 miles in some cases. They migrate down into Mexico. And we actually have Mexican free-tailed bats that are in the Austin roosts all winter, but it turns out that those are bats from the more northern part of the free-tail range. So the bats that are in the bridges, Congress Avenue Bridge and McNeil and in the caves, have been proven to be from Oklahoma or Kansas. So they migrate as well. They just don't go as far as Mexico. They stop in Austin and they see, whoa, there's some pretty nice habitat here, and they move in to the bridges and the caves, and then they go back north in the springtime, just as our bats are coming back north from Mexico to Austin.
Hi, there's been a lot of expanded development, new development in Austin. How has that impacted the bats in the city?
Bats, particularly in the large roosts like Congress Avenue Bridge.
Or anywhere in the city.
Yeah.
I mean, Congress Avenue is a pretty stable, constant, but there are a lot of other things happening.
Yeah, what we've seen sort of on a small scale at least is bats getting into buildings accidentally, and an example that could be happening more and more because of all of the high-rises that are being built in downtown Austin. We got a call from someone in one of the high-rise apartment buildings down on Rainey Street a few years ago, and they said, well, this woman who lives in an apartment here was away on vacation for 2 weeks. She came home and there were, at least a dozen dead and dying Mexican free-tailed bats in her apartment. So it turned out that what had happened there was the issue that I was talking about. They build these buildings and they leave spaces for bats to get in. And in this case, all of the HVAC systems were all lined up from the roof down through all the apartments. And in every apartment, there was a system behind a closed door. Well, somehow there was an opening and bats got into that system. Now, I don't know if they got into other apartments. They may have, but this is the one we heard about. And they got out from under that door into the woman's apartment. So this is just one example of something that could happen that would put bats and people in the kind of proximity that we never want. And unfortunately, those bats, all of them died. We were hoping to take one home to try to to treat it, but the woman was really frightened, and she asked that we euthanize the bat and have it tested, which of course we did. But that's the kind of thing that can kill large numbers of bats needlessly, and can cause a lot of fear. So we don't really know on a big scale how this is going to affect bats, but it depends very much on people understanding the nature of bats and the relative risk of being in close proximity to bats. And I think that it's something that the need for it doesn't ever stop. So this kind of education is important constantly. Because every time you see a notice in the newspaper saying a rabid bat was found, it's reported in a way that doesn't usually contain the proper context. Of course rabid bats are found. Bats that are found on the ground sometimes have rabies, but that's a very specific sample of bats that are taken to the health department for testing. And the more people have close contact in a building, the more that sort of thing is going to happen, and the more misinformation can be spread about bats. And I don't really believe that the bats in those large public roosts are ever really protected. I just feel like it's going to be something that's ongoing. There's going to be a big development. You may be aware of the South Central Waterfront development down near Congress Avenue Bridge and in some locations east and west. And it's about 30-some private properties that are all going to be sold over time, including the Statesman, which has been sold, to developers who are going to build mixed-use developments all along the waterfront. And so we've been part of that conversation with city planners. Lee and I have been in many meetings and trying to make sure that the bats are taken into consideration along every step of the way. We're nervous about it. Development is something that is going to happen. Austin is big and it's going to get bigger. That's going to happen. But it's important to constantly remind people and builders and developers along every step of the way that there are things that they can do to prevent that kind of unwanted proximity of people to bats. Does that answer your question?
Well, thank you, Dianne. We're running out of time, but we wanted just to say thanks for you and Lee coming today to speak about bats. It was great to learn more about bats.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you for coming to a public affairs forum. And it was held most Sundays at First Unitarian Universalist Church of Austin. And I think that's it, right? Close it out. All right, well, thank you.
Thank you, Dan. Thanks very much.
Thank you.